everybody. Welcome to SecOps Studios, your weekly show for all things SaaS and cybersecurity. Today, we're excited to speak with David Murray, independent strategic advisor for technology and security companies. David has a wealth of experience in the IT space, specifically within the financial services industry. We'll talk about why cybersecurity is so important more than ever in the financial services. So with that, let me introduce Dan, your host. Dan, take it away.
Jeremy, thank you so much for that introduction. And guys, thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to be talking to David Murray about financial services, cybersecurity within it. There's a lot of news around it. But David, before we go too much further, why don't you give just a brief introduction of yourself, kind of the superhero origin story, as it were, kind of how you got here today and why we're talking.
Thank you for having me, guys. Yeah, a little bit of background. I've spent the last 25 years working on programs in IT strategy, operations, technology engineering, and management consulting, a lot of that with the financial services sector. So a substantial portion of my career has been working with and for companies like Morgan Stanley, AIG, Bank of America, Fidelity Investments, and quite a few of the others. And so having led a lot of major technology initiatives and changes, cybersecurity has been implicit in that. So I've had an opportunity to see how that evolves and how the financial services industry deals with the challenge of security and as it has continued to grow. And then more recently, over the last several years, worked for a network data analytics technology company and brought a security offering to market, also servicing financial services. So I've sort of seen it from all sides.
Right, fantastic, and that's part of the reason why we're talking to you today. You have, like Jeremy said, a wealth of knowledge of both sides. But before we kind of dive deeper into it, let's kind of just paint a picture, as it were. When we talk about financial services, like, what does that mean? What kind of companies are we talking about? Is that just banking, or what does that kind of encompass?
Yeah, as a sector, the financial services industry is huge, and you could argue it includes everything from banks to credit unions to hedge funds to payments providers to small fintech firms overall. But one of the things that's interesting about financial services is it's first of all, it's where the money is oftentimes.
Right.
Literally and figuratively. And as an industry, it's a bit of a lightning rod, right? What happens within the stock markets, what happens within the economy ultimately materializes to create volatility. It has a massive impact on government legislation and vice versa. And so it's kind of a lightning rod for the industry, whether it's insurance products or whether it's pure bank accounts, or more recently the things that are in the news, things related to trading and stock purchase and commodities prices and whatnot.
Right.
That's financial services, and so it is a massive industry. If you think about the top 10 financial services companies in the country, they probably have annual revenue that's equivalent to, would probably make them a top 20 GDP country in the world.
Wow.
JP Morgan Chase alone, which is the largest bank in the United States, over 100 billion in revenue. They're probably a top 65 country in terms of GDP.
Just on their own. That's fantastic. Well, yeah, thank you so much for kind of painting that picture. And obviously with so many different things, obviously, from stocks to banking, there's a lot of spaces that cybersecurity is needed. So, how do they kind of handle that as we kind of delve more into the cybersecurity part of this? What does that look like? Obviously, there's a lot of different moving parts. Like you mentioned, JP Morgan is a top 60 country just on GDP if you look at its revenue. So is there a difference when they're dealing with cybersecurity? And kind of, you also mentioned them being a lightning rod. Does that also kind of mirror when they're talking about cybersecurity? Are they kind of a large, what's the word? Do they get attacked a lot? Are they kind of a main focus of a lot of these groups?
They're a lightning rod for a lot of things. I mean, first of all, I think, as I described, it's a lot of businesses in one, right? So we can talk a bit about, maybe the best example would be some of these bulge bracket banks, the Bank of America, the JPMCs of the world, and the Wells Fargos and whatnot. But there are a lot of businesses in one, right? They have trading businesses or investment banking businesses where they are spearheading large mergers and acquisitions. And so it's critical that information be kept very secure, and that there aren't leakages associated with it, because it can affect how a deal comes to market, whether it's a public offering or whether it's an acquisition or a divestiture. There's retail and commercial banking, right? It's pure bank accounts. So you're dealing with firms that may have 50 or 80 million accounts between businesses and consumers. And so that's an awful lot of PII to protect.
Right.
You have credit card. So how many transactions for a card provider do you think you're dealing with, right? It's, absolutely hundreds of millions of transactions, if not considerably more, for the largest credit card providers in the world. And then finally, you've got a whole slew of other insurance and other financial products that they're offering. So when you think about it that way, each of those different businesses has slightly different requirements. So financial services tends to invest very heavily in technology. So a lot of their operations are digital, a lot of their consumer interaction is digital, and so you see quite a bit of emphasis and accessibility. There's a surface there to ultimately attack. And so at the highest level, when you look at financial services, and I described it a bit as a lightning rod, right? They're investing heavily in technology. They have massive amounts of PII. They are, they put high emphasis on return on investment using technology. So they are also embracing sometimes the leading edge, because they are big investors in technology. And so and they're also hyper competitive with each other and as an industry. And so this makes them attractive, right, for several reasons and to several potential parties. First of all, they're among the most heavily targeted sector in the world today. And one reason is by criminals, right? 70% or something like that. I think it's high 60s or 70% of cyber attacks are generated by criminals. Well, why attack a bank? If you ask, Willie Sutton, did he rob banks? It's where the money is, right?
Of course.
Right? It's not just about, it can be about everything from credit card fraud or bank account fraud, but also it's the ability to impact someone. Think about a trading operation where you have an algorithm that is initiating a lot of the activity and change in the marketplace. Well, you don't necessarily need to steal money from bank accounts. You may just need to disrupt an algorithm in order to impact a given stock. So there are a lot of risks, and people stand to make a lot of money by accessing it. Plus, you've got 50 or 100 or 200 million either credit card transactions or accounts. That's a big surface area for PII.
Yeah.
So that's
definitely.
one category.
There's a lot of stuff to take there, and yeah, and like you said, that's where the money is. Now, a question that kind of comes to mind, with there being so many different businesses within each one of these financial services, obviously there's going to be different needs, and there's going to be different challenges that come from, certain security measures. What does that look like, and kind of how do they mesh that together? Because already I know just a regular organization, departments kind of butt heads, but if those departments are now full businesses, how do they kind of work that out and, make sure that they're secure while also maybe not hurting other parts of their industry or their business?
It's a great question. I think to answer it, you have to take a little bit of a step back and look at where else they may be targeted. Right? We talked about the criminal aspect, but keep in mind another source of cyber attack for financial services could be hacktivists, right? People who
Okay.
believe financial services symbolizes greed, hasn't been equitable or hasn't produced equity. And so therefore, there is a certain righteous driver to attack. Look at the last several weeks or the last 2 weeks with what's taken place with GameStop and some of the other firms, right? There has been a willful and deliberate targeting by
Uh-huh.
consumers, fueling consumer sentiment to target firms that have shorted certain securities, right? This is very much not just, this is not about necessarily stealing from the banks, but it is about a certain emotional reaction to what
Mhm.
banks may symbolize and the power that they have within the industry. Um, because of what banks and the financial sector mean to the economy and the stability of, of the country, there are plenty of nation state actors who are also part of the targeting of financial services
Definitely.
institutions. And so you want to have a big impact on a foe. Today it's not about, you are not the hegemon by having the largest army. It's by having the most cyber resources to be able to disrupt, and that can be done by disrupting sentiment, disrupting elections, and disrupting an economy. So that's another big target for them overall. And so you see that, and then of course you see incidents. So to your question about how do you treat it when you've got so many different businesses that are part of the same organization? Well, each of those businesses has a different set of drivers. Electronic trading operations are all about speed, and
Right.
controls and technologies that slow down the transmission of data or the transmission of an order are the enemy of speed. And so you're dealing with an environment that is highly optimized for speed. So when you can trigger a trade in something measured in microseconds or nanoseconds, adding additional technology and weight is directly antithetical to your competitiveness. So
Okay.
if I'm a CISO, of a large bulge bracket bank, and I have to cater to electronic trading, but I also have to cater to credit card processing, which may be very centralized in key systems. The challenge is I need to try to find ways to enable the business to do what it has to. And so structurally, the way that has manifested within financial services is a CISO for each business unit as well as an enterprise CISO. And so there are different enterprise-wide policies that are implemented, and then there are also business-centric technologies and approaches that are instituted. So the strategies are very varied even within an organization that then roll up to one overall set of cybersecurity approaches, technologies, and policies. And of course, that reports up to increasingly the board of directors, not just company management, not just firm management.
Awesome. Yeah. And so that is interesting that so they kind of have an individual CISO for each business. That does make a lot of sense because in answering questions, showing just what all those threat vectors are, there's a lot. and we've definitely seen even with to your point about, kind of the hacktivists, we've seen in the last few weeks how disruptive things can get, when a group of individuals, and that probably is not something that a CISO was looking out for. I'd love to talk to the CISO that saw that coming. But when they're kind of making these decisions, when they're looking at technologies, obviously they have to be excruciatingly careful because, like you said, they're very, very much targeted. But when there is a breach, typically how is that dealt with? I know you said that they're very competitive. Do these banks talk with each other? These financial industries, corporations, do they say, hey, I was breached by this, and have conversations among themselves? Or what does that look like if there is something that happens?
Yeah, Wall Street firms, right? And again, when we talk about financial services, it means many different things.
Mhm.
So when we talk about the big banks or the big trading operations or whatnot, again, under the heading of Wall Street firms, they are hyper competitive and super protective, right? One of the things that may or may not be recognized outside of the financial services industry is for professionals within financial services, there is a concept of garden. So if you're an executive VP or an executive director or a managing director of a large bank and you resign and decide to go somewhere else, you are on a period of garden leave during which you cannot work anywhere else. And so that's part of the contract and part of the employment arrangement. And it's because they hold both their technology content as well as their business content so dear and want to protect that. And so firms tend to be very private about what they're doing in general to either protect themselves or to institute new technology because it translates oftentimes into a direct competitive advantage. As it relates to cybersecurity, what we see is there is a certain amount of collaboration and information sharing. And what we've seen in financial services over the years is when financial services firms get together and really share information, they're very powerful. So when firms, as an example, this is probably a 20-year-old example now, but when Wall Street firms were frustrated with the prices and the cost of maintenance of Sun Microsystem, they ultimately got together and planned to use and ultimately credentialized Linux as an alternative, and many Wall Street firms en masse, moved technology. Similarly, when Wall Street firms are upset about the price that they pay for market data, well, recently you'll see that Wall Street firms have gotten together and started their own exchange, members exchange, in order to offset some of the costs of data. So when it comes to cybersecurity, it's typically not a single firm, or oftentimes not a single firm that's attacked, especially if there is a nation-state actor, right? In past years, we've seen denial of service attacks, not just on one firm, but on many banks and firms across weeks or even months. And so they collaborate with each other on some of these strategies, and they certainly collaborate with each other on major attacks to understand if they are broader. In addition, again, because of the role that financial services plays in our society, you'll see that most the largest firms also have collaborations and exchange information with national security and homeland security committees and whatnot. They both are part of it, but they also consume a lot of resources, and so both electrical resources and financial resources, and so they are part of the stability of the country, even if the country is disrupted. So think about it. If the country's infrastructure is impacted, and there's a massive power outage, a sustained power outage, or some other sort of large, widespread attack or interruption of infrastructure, well, commerce potentially grinds to a halt. You can't go to an ATM. Right. You can't file an electronic payment, and so there are a number of things that pressure financial services firms to look at how they are providing resiliency with respect to national infrastructure and vice versa. And that creates a lot of collaboration and information sharing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And a question that kind of comes to mind is, so you said, when one of them is getting attacked, typically it's a lot of them are getting attacked. Do you think that kind of gives them some form of I don't want to, not a pack mentality, but it's not, if it's happening to you, it's happening to everyone. So it kind of gives them that kind of solace, or that they're going to catch it. Does that kind of, is that an air that comes in there? Like, oh, well, they're attacking all of us, so we're going to catch it? Or, what does that kind of mindset look like?
No, it's funny. It's a bit like, you don't see airlines boast about their safety record, right? For good reason, right? You don't boast about the fact that you haven't had an airplane crash, right? Because you're
right.
And there are many things that implicate it. While financial services firms tend to have very high confidence in their capabilities, I think that there is a perpetual concern and paranoia, and rightfully so, about the impacts of cyber attack. I mean, if you speak to executives, not just in technology or security, not just the CISOs or that portion, but if you talk to the head of, recently was a quote, former head of trading, global head of trading for Goldman Sachs was asked, what are the things that concern him most in the world? And immediate response was, the thing that most keeps me up at night is the impact of cyber attack. And if you
Wow.
look across the industry, several years ago, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, expressed that this is one of the biggest threats to the financial system overall, and they back that up with the amount of money that they now invest in cybersecurity. So I think that the types of attacks are so varied. When there is a widespread attack and the ability of firms to say, we're seeing a number of strange activities, it helps bolster the collective defenses. That's certainly true. But you will also see, and a good bit of cyber attack we know is around phishing and social engineering. And so firms have invested quite a bit in education and protection and compliance with education, right? It's not unusual for any big company, especially within financial services, to sometimes test employees with an email and see if they go so far as to click on that malicious link or
right.
So there's a lot around it, but there's a lot invested in training that they do share. What they don't share oftentimes are outside of individual collaborative efforts, are their specific strategies for combating cyber attack. And that means many of them are building their own analytics platforms, and they're bringing some of their own special sauce, right? Understanding their unique technology infrastructures, how to protect it.
Interesting. And so you kind of, I love that answer. And so it's always going to be something that they're worried about, even though they do kind of have that, we're all in this together, helps a little bit. But so
something
as
like
we're seeing
cyber attack to bring everyone together in financial.
just really, big kumbaya when, there's a ransomware breach. But so we're kind of talking about they're investing so much money. We're seeing cyber attacks rapidly change. And I mean, if you want to call it a cyber attack, or these things that affect the markets, we're seeing, all the stuff that happened with GameStop. It's always changing. It's a new thing. So how do these, CISOs and security, how do they try to stay ahead of it? Because it seems like them being such a main target of all of this stuff, and they're going to be the first ones that get attacked with the newest thing. So how do they try to stay ahead of that, or what does that kind of look like in the background when they're just trying to almost just keep their head above water when we're living in a world where cyber attacks are becoming more and more common?
Yeah, I don't know that there is a special sauce, right? There's no silver bullet that combats what's next. They've gotten more proactive. All of them have invested in threat intelligence in different ways, and that means both what they share among themselves as well as that which is commercially available. And in some cases, you will see a number of financial services firms hiring from former government and intelligence community. Because they're building, in some cases, they're building their own threat intelligence process as well as their own response, their own both active response and reactive response measures. So they're building in intelligence, they're building in threat hunting and investing heavily in that, and then obviously they've got response approaches and technologies. The same way firms were running disaster recovery tests and plans and scenarios, their cybersecurity response has been heavily involved now with active red team activities where you have, across the year, some scheduled, some not scheduled tabletop activities, or direct actual activities where you're responding to a simulated cyber attack. So that's an area. Training is internal, and employee training is another area that they've invested quite heavily in. A third is certainly in technologies, both in vendor technologies as well as in as well as in homegrown technologies. I mean, I think one of the latest statistics from a study from one of the big four firms was financial services, or at least about 100 respondents, are spending about $2,500 per employee.
Wow.
On cybersecurity. And so that is a combination of technologies and training and reinforcement and compliance and whatnot. Some firms, I will tell you, and this is definitely a standard deviation or two, but if you look at some of the hedge funds, who have very unique cultures within them, are so serious about cybersecurity that if they find people who don't have a strong security mindset and have demonstrated a level of carelessness, they will even go so far as to put a person on warning or dismiss them associated with it. So it's taken very seriously, and again, that's an extreme example and a very unique type of firm. But it's one of the things they're doing, and this combination of technologies and building an entire network operations center that links all of the technologies together. The last piece is then policy, both technology and application architecture policy and vendor and supplier oversight policy, right? If you think about some of the largest cyber attacks, certainly the most noteworthy ones we've seen in the last couple of years, right? Equifax would be a great example, right?
Yeah.
Equifax was as simple as hygiene, right? It was really about, if I recall, they didn't patch, there was an Apache struts patch that was never applied, a security fix that wasn't applied. And that was found, and it exposed, hundreds of millions of individuals to risk. If you look at things outside of industry and something like, the big Target breach from years ago, right? It wasn't directly about them, it was about their vendors, right? It was, I think at the time, if memory serves, it was an HVAC vendor and supplier. Well, not surprisingly, financial services have their own special supply chain and make heavy use of vendors. And so they have implemented, when they screen their vendors and providers, they think very seriously about cybersecurity and how protective each of their suppliers is around cybersecurity. So these are all strategies that are how they combat that. But more than anything, it's about the use of data. And the last piece, which I think is important, is I mentioned before that financial services makes heavy use of technology and of data, right? Think about financial service products and credit cards, and just like everyone else, when you think about this concept of serving a demographic of one, right, serving an individual consumer, if you have data related to that person and their spending habits and their buying habit, what they typically do with their money, what types of transactions on their account versus their credit card versus their total debt load, et cetera, right? You can offer them products and services that can be very customized and ultimately generate revenue from that. Well, one of the things that financial services has embraced is the use of not just big data, but of machine learning and AI technologies. Well,
of course,
one of the big challenges with machine learning and AI technologies is they're dependent on a lot of data. And when you bring together massive amounts of data in one place, you've just created concentration risk, right? So if you're trying to steal the world's gold, right? Do you go to each individual owner who has a gold coin, or hey, if you aggregate it all in Fort Knox, great. Now I know where the gold is, and now I know where to go after it. And so they're also starting to look at technologies that allow them to gain the same benefits, newer types of technologies that allow them to gain benefits of machine learning. And there are new startup firms that offer some of these technologies that allow you to gain those benefits without aggregating all of the data together, because they're finding that in and of itself is a risk. So now you have these opposing forces of machine learning and tremendous efficiency and insight from data. But if I bring it together, I'm ultimately exposing myself to risk. So how do I get the benefits without the risk? And that is part of the calculation that firms are increasingly considering.
Yeah, it's kind of like, what do you do? How do you run your business? But you have to have all this data. But like you said, then you have concentration risk, and now, but then how do you deal with that? So kind of it's solving a problem then creating a problem. Another question that kind of comes to mind is, kind of forward looking. Like I said before, we're seeing a lot of different things change, and obviously, the financial industry is really trying to stay ahead of all these cyber risks. What do you kind of see are going to be like the future big risks? Obviously, like we've seen in the last few weeks, we can't really bet on anything to be normal. So what do you kind of see as the future big threats that are going to be facing, or the financial industry will be facing, if you can name one or two?
Well, predicting what the next threat is certainly a tricky one. When you take a look at the activities of the last couple of weeks with the Reddit Wall Street bets and GameStop activity, which has obviously been heavily publicized, right? That's not a cyber attack, but it is an impact, and it does impact the amount of volume and activity that may happen, again, specifically around trading activities. One of the big threats that's been rising for years, I don't think it's the newest thing, but I think it will continue heavily into the future, is insider threat. So, and this is both inadvertent, so these are employees or insiders who inadvertently share data that exposes the firm's major risk, or maliciously. And so again, we've seen, this increase in over time of employees who may feel wronged, employees who may disagree with what their employer is doing or policies that the employer has instituted, who decide to take it upon themselves and rationalize to themselves taking data or stealing data, disrupting information. And this has happened in the past, and I think we'll continue to see some of that. But it's something that firms are turning their attention to, because it's very hard to trust your employees and invest heavily in them, and at the same time be worried that your employees are a big risk. I think we'll continue to see more nation-state attacks on financial services. Just what we've seen in social media, and more recently, I think, that are very newsworthy. If you want to hit a state hard, go after the things that ultimately erode confidence of its consumers and of its citizens, and the safety that, whether that's financial security and safety and otherwise. I think you'll continue to see things like what we saw in the last week, whereby it's not quite hacktivism, but where there's a strong sentiment that, hey, I want to stick it to certain big financial services players. Again, in this case, firms that are doing a lot of short selling, in the case of GameStop and the other securities. So I think those are all things that you'll see. This will be offset or potentially further burdensome due to legislation. So I think we will see more, which can be both a benefit and it can be a heavy cost, right? Banks and the financial services industry overall has gone through periods of being extremely heavily regulated to being slightly less regulated. And the challenge and the risk is always that the regulation creates more burden than it does the actual benefit, and that's always a risk, right? In 2008, following the financial crisis, we saw a lot of congressmen grilling executives at financial firms, and at that point, it was obvious that there was a disconnect in what our legislators believed was legal, or what was enabled by law that had been passed by our legislature, and how that was ultimately manifesting within financial services. So if you don't understand the financial system, right, then, and really understand both how it operates and the threats that it faces, then the legislation can create burden without benefit. And so that is a risk, and we'll see which direction it takes, because I would actually argue that regulators have gotten much smarter and more knowledgeable in recent years. But right now, there are financial regulations from FINRA, New York State Department of Financial Services, 3 years ago or so, imposed regulations that require financial firms to have identified a CISO, for that CISO to take on a certain amount of accountability. You're seeing more recently, actually, now a tightening of those types of things. What was it? The National Security Clearing Corp. The NSCC recently, probably within the last year, filed a request for a rule change with the SEC, asking them to ensure that financial services firms have a cybersecurity program. Now, as you can see, have a program may not provide enough depth. And so they've asked not only that they have a program, but that that program be consistent with a known framework, something like ISO 27001 or something like a NIST framework. And so that will create more burden, and as firms try to combat, and they may also provide benefits, especially for smaller financial firms who may not be investing as heavily in cybersecurity. The biggest banks today are investing very, very heavily in cybersecurity, up to 3-4% of their revenue, and probably indirectly more than that. So there's a lot of investment, but there's also a lot of money to be gained. And so as firms adopt more cloud technologies, as they adopt, in some cases, Office 365 or Google technologies, right, there are different threats that they face. There are ransomware threats that they face, and so they will continue to invest in technologies that offset that risk, especially firms that don't have the sophistication and investment of the biggest banks. Those are the ones who I think have probably greater risk.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot more. Kind of going back to steal your phrase, that concentration risk when you're going to those cloud environments, Office 365, Google Workplace. For a lot of organizations, and I'm sure this is true for financial industries as well, that becomes a wealth of information. It's one place that there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on, and there's so much data coming into it that there's a lot of places that you can gain access to that, right?
There's a lot of PII, and if you're able to affect someone's account, obviously there's direct access to funds. So firms have a lot to protect against, right? The cybersecurity, but also they have heavy investment in things like anti-money laundering. So they're looking at things that may not be direct cybercrime, but are still financial crime. And I think what we'll see is the overlaps between financial crime and cybercrime, right, are inherently intermingled in a world where digital banking, digital payments, digital investment is all part of the fiber of how we live.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's how do you rob a bank? You don't go into your local Chase and have a gun. You write some code and try to breach it that way. So that's how it's changing. But Dave, this has been a fantastic talk. I really appreciate it. But before we let you go, what do you think is one really big takeaway when we're looking at cybersecurity in the financial industry? What's for everyone who's watching, what's one thing that you'd love for them to really just take away from all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably understanding what financial services is, the threats that they face. Being a CISO of a large bank is a really hard job, right? It is a really difficult job. The other thing I would say, look, for the consumer is, yes, this is a cybercrime. Everyone is at risk. And while, banks are investing, you should feel reasonably secure that there are a lot of investments and there is the right level of attention. And so, you don't have to necessarily live in continued fear that your assets are at risk. But there's a lot, but I think it's a reminder for every individual consumer, right? If I'm Joe at home, using Office 365, but I'm doing it on a computer that has my taxes and my login to my bank and all of my pictures of my kids and so forth and so on, right? Everyone is at risk, right? The financial services sector is one that is highly targeted. But I think what it really does is it reinforces the state of the state that we're living in right now in terms of potential exposure, but also the fact that there are ways to protect. Good hygiene is always going to be number one. But there's a certain amount of technology investment and just being careful. But it's a fascinating sector, is what I would say. Again, it gets more interesting either by excitement when markets are doing well, or when there are events, like people making a lot of money, possibly even at the expense of short sellers. And it gets a lot of press when there is concern about inequity, right? That becomes very visible, with financial services, or when, as was the case 12 years ago in the financial crisis, when there's a belief that hard-earned tax dollars are going toward financial services. It's complicated, and it's a particularly vital part of our society. So I think there's a lot to take away, but the biggest things are just a broader understanding of how hard it is, but how much is being done around it to protect that sector.
Awesome. Yeah, no, we're all kind of involved in it. I like that part. I might not be involved in the financial services, but I still have stuff on my computer that is connected to that and is still a target. But that's awesome, David. Thank you again for taking the time to speak with us today. I know I learned a lot. I like to always pretend that I know a lot of stuff, but I've taken a lot of notes here. So I do appreciate the time for you coming on, and everyone who's watching, please go give David M. Murray a follow on LinkedIn. He's a fantastic resource, and we're definitely going to have you on again.
Thanks. I look forward to it. I appreciate it, guys. Thanks. It's fun.